Chapter 2. Cindy shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she tried to maintain an interest in the data being presented. Despite her determination to focus, she couldn't help letting her mind wander. She'd only been about 10 minutes late that morning, and neither her boss nor any of her new colleagues had seemed to notice. But she'd felt flustered. She still did. The trip to her new workplace had been hell. Despite leaving Nicholas's school with plenty of time to spare, she'd managed to catch every red light, hit every patch of roadwork. Heck, she'd even been so sweaty and worked up that at one point, her foot had slipped off the clutch, causing her car to stall. She hadn't stalled her car since she was a university student, rambling her way through unknown Melbourne streets, learning the hard way about negotiating trams and executing those dreaded hook turns. Cindy scrunched her face, recalling the angry honks as she'd embarrassingly had to restart the ignition. She hated looking foolish. The worst part of the journey, though, she remembered now, as she scribbled a few meaningless words on her notepad in an attempt to look engaged by the presentation before her, was when she'd realised that Nicholas had left his lunchbox behind. After finally getting through the worst of it, she'd taken a moment to touch up her makeup in the rearview mirror when she'd noticed the fire engine red container sitting next to his booster seat. This had brought up a wave of irrationality. Am I a bad mother if I pretend I didn't see it? Will I lose my job if I'm a bit late? And worst of all, why is it always me and not Emmett who's compromised by our decision to have a child? As Cindy replayed the resentful way she'd done a screeching U-turn and headed back to the school, she told herself to calm down. I'm being silly. With a slow, deep breath, she forced herself to return her focus to the boring man at the front of the room. The Docklands area is one of Australia's largest urban renewal projects. The speaker, a stocky chap in his early 50s, was monotonously reading off the slide in front of them. There are several different precincts for which we've sold development rights to various private companies. Cindy's eyes glazed over. The Docklands was a relatively new development on Melbourne's ports, and one which had not yet won over the hearts of locals. Until today, she'd never visited the suburb, and this tedious presentation wasn't making her feel like she'd missed much. Despite promising to make the most of the city's waterways, the precinct was known to be soulless and poorly planned. The area had also been haunted by the laughably problematic development of a giant Ferris wheel, which was meant to be similar to the famous London Eye. But after opening 2 years behind schedule, it had to be shut down almost immediately due to structural defects. It then sat desolate for 5 years before finally reopening. None of this, Cindy noted, was being discussed by the man at the front of the room. From her handbag at her feet came a bright glow. She discreetly reached down, fumbling with her mobile to check the text message. How's the new job going? I've been thinking about you all morning. XX. Cindy felt a rush of affection for her husband, followed quickly by a pang of guilt. It wasn't his fault he had to work such long hours. Emmett had been a policeman from the day they'd met, so it was hardly fair to blame him for the tough lifestyle that the job continued to provide. Late nights, unpredictable hours, and being on call were all part of it. Cindy couldn't even begin to remember how many family functions, trips to the zoo, nights out had been cut short by the ringing of Emmett's mobile, and the same apologetic look he'd give as he'd explain why he needed to disappear. Bringing her handbag to her lap, Cindy pondered how to write back without being noticed. A tap on her shoulder made her jump. You're not planning on staying here all day? Vanya, Cindy's new boss, was standing in front of her. Embarrassed, she got up. The presentation was over. She'd zoned out again. As she trotted back to her desk, Cindy considered the possibility of getting a decent glass of wine with lunch. It was probably not the done thing to drink during the workday anymore, but who would know? After clicking through to her empty inbox, she searched online for nearby licensed cafes. Mercifully, there were several, and she happily scrolled through their drinks lists before selecting a place that served her favourite Hunter Valley White. Perfect. With the crisp taste of the white wine already dancing on her tongue, Cindy grabbed her handbag and headed for the door. She was surviving her first day back at work. Surely that was something to celebrate. Emmett yawned, checking his watch and listening to his stomach grumbling impatiently as he did so. He hadn't stopped all morning, and that discipline was paying off. On the notepad in front of him, he was pleased to see that most of the long list of phone numbers he'd been working through now had a hearty line drawn across them. Only 3 more to go. He picked up the handset of his desk phone, ready to dial the next number. "Detective, are you there?" Emmett felt himself shrink as he plonked the phone back down. "Glad I caught you." First Constable Stephen Carter, his overly enthusiastic junior, marched through the doorway without so much as the pretense of knocking. "I know you have your hands full at the moment, but the Flemington station rang. They're passing us a case, and it sounds pretty serious." Emmett forced himself not to roll his eyes. He didn't want to dampen Stephen's enthusiasm, but he highly doubted it would be serious. "It's a missing mother of 2. She didn't pick her kids up from their holiday program on Friday, and she hasn't been heard from since. The local members were looking into it over the weekend, but they haven't got anywhere. They say the husband's going hysterical. They want us to handle it." Emmett sighed. "Okay, well, firstly, check with Uniform that they've tried all the usual avenues. Local hospitals, women's refuges, shopping centres, the pokies." He stopped himself. There it was again, that cynicism that seemed to creep into everything he did these days. He didn't like the jaded view he'd developed, but the truth remained. Despite the huge number of missing Australians, most did not disappear against their own will. Great. Stephen appeared to be writing the directions down verbatim. "And once you've done that..." Emmett swiveled his chair away from his younger colleague to signal that their chat was coming to an end. "Make sure you set up an interview with the husband. If there is anything concerning about her disappearance, he'll be our first port of call." Stephen's voice was nervous. Emmett's stomach sank. "What?" "I've kind of already spoken to the husband and asked him to come in." "Okay." "He's waiting at reception now." "What?" Emmett turned back to find Stephen's face flushed pink. "Well, is there anyone else who can do the interview with you?" "I'm only just starting my preliminary notes on the Norman investigation, and I don't know anything about this new case." Stephen shrugged apologetically. "Give me 5 minutes." Emmett grabbed his phone again, angrily punching in the next number on his list. He was going to knock off this stupid task first. The man would just have to wait. By the time he emerged from his office, the reception area was empty. "They've already gone through," Annette pointed down the hall. "But they're waiting for you." Emmett forced a smile, hoping she hadn't noticed the growl of his stomach as he passed. Inside the nearest interview room, he found his younger colleague self-consciously flicking through sheets of paper, unsuccessfully trying to make small talk with the brawny man seated opposite. "This is Brian Gibson." Emmett nodded to the man, who was hugging his arms across his chest, his legs splayed unattractively either side of the chair. His wife Natalie didn't come home on Friday, and he's quite worried. Emmett extended a hand and did a quick mental assessment. Brian seemed like a tradesman of some sort. Tall, physically strong, but carrying some unnecessary padding around his gut and sporting well-defined lines around his eyes. Tell us what's happened. He took a seat next to Stephen, across a cheap brown table covered in mug stains. I don't know what's happened. That's why I've come to you. Brian's voice was curt, and Emmett watched with interest as the man fidgeted, as though uncomfortable in his own skin. Neither detective said anything. She didn't pick the kids up from their holiday program, and she never came home, Brian eventually offered. I've been telling the cops this all weekend and they haven't done a thing. Something bad has happened. Why else would she just vanish? Emmett forced himself to stay quiet. He could think of many reasons. A secret lover, mental health problems, financial stress, just being sick of your plain old boring existence. Was your wife showing any unusual behaviours before she disappeared? Stephen asked. No, Brian scowled. Natalie is just a happy, quiet mum. She loves our 2 kids. She wouldn't leave like this. What sort of work does she do? Work? Brian looked confused. I assumed she was working, given the children were being sent to childcare during the school holidays. No, she's a stay-at-home mum. And it wasn't really childcare, it was a holiday program run by the local sports club. Dario plays footy there anyway, and he wanted to go with his friends, so Natalie thought she may as well send both children and have some time to herself. Stephen nodded, writing this down. Dario, that's your son? Yes, but the program's not just about footy. They do all sorts of activities in the club rooms, like arts and crafts and stuff, so Natalie thought both kids would like it. I didn't really think they should go. I thought it was a waste of money. I see, Stephen murmured. And how is your wife using the free time? Brian shrugged. I have no idea. To be honest, I don't really know why she needed time to herself. Natalie likes looking after the kids, and the program costs a fortune. I told her not to send them. Emmett looked at the bulky frame of the man sitting opposite them. He recognised the tension in his voice. He and Cindy had had many similar arguments. But you love being at home with Nicholas. He'd said that once, and learnt quickly not to do it again. That had been a bad patch in their relationship, only a few months after Nicholas was born. Emmett bit his lower lip as the memory of that time resurfaced. That was when Cindy was crying all the time. Postnatal depression, the doctor had called it. Just bloody shit. That's what it had been. The thought of his wife made him anxious. He'd promised her he'd be home at a reasonable hour that night, but the day was quickly spiralling out of control. Does she have any close friends or family that she might have visited? I've called everyone I can think of already, but she isn't exactly a big socializer, and her parents are at home with us. Her parents live with you? Yes, well, we live at their place, actually. Emmett noticed Brian's upper lip curled as he said this. They built a townhouse out the back of their property. It was a gift to us on our wedding day, and Natalie and I have lived there ever since. That's very generous of them. Natalie's parents are Italian, and they're pretty traditional. They wanted Natalie with them, and it wasn't like we were really given a choice. I don't think they'd have it any other way. Emmett smiled, mentally noting the bitter way Brian had said this. Despite his best intentions, he was beginning to feel drawn into this case. It was unusual for a mother to take off without her 2 young children. He wondered if Natalie's parents shared her husband's concern. So if she didn't come home and didn't visit friends, where do you think she went? Stephen prompted. Brian appeared to be considering this for a moment when his demeanour soured. If I bloody well knew that, then I wouldn't be sitting here with you idiots, would I? A fist smacked onto the table. Maybe, instead of asking me stupid questions, you should be out there trying to find my wife. In the tense silence that followed, Emmett's eyes fell onto Brian's clenched hand. A purple bruise was evident between his thumb and index finger, and several red scratches could be seen near the wrist. That's a nasty wound you've got there. Brian quickly withdrew the fist under the table. You need to find my wife. Emmett opened his notebook and flicked to a blank page. Don't worry, Mr. Gibson. He scribbled down some notes. We intend to. The boy was sitting in the corner, hugging his knees to his chest. Ben watched from the window. As the first person to have had contact with the child, he'd been asked to stay with him while the police called around for any relatives who would be prepared to take him in. They'd hoped that over the course of the day, the boy might open up to him. But, so far, he'd been little help. Aside from a few sobs, the child, who Ben guessed couldn't be older than 5, remained silent, leaving the welfare worker to awkwardly prod for information. My name is Ben. What's yours? Nothing. How long have you lived in that flat? Still nothing. What's your favourite game? Do you like football or soccer? The only thing he'd been able to ascertain, with a fair degree of confidence, was that the boy was not comfortable with physical contact. Earlier, he'd attempted to give him a gentle pat on the back. The child's automatic flinching reflex had warned him not to try that again. Any luck? Ben directed his question at the doorway, where a policeman had appeared, holding 2 plastic cups. No, nothing at all. Have you been able to talk to him? Ben shook his head as he took the drinks, passing one over to the huddled figure. It's hot chocolate. Why don't you try some? I bet it's yummy. The boy didn't respond. His head still dropped forward, his arms shivering slightly as he squeezed his knees into his body. Ben's mind turned to the days ahead. He shuddered at the thought of all the paperwork he'd have to fill out. He and Denise had worked with Lorna for nearly 2 years, and not once had they suspected she had a child. They'd been aware of the drugs, and the prostitution, of course. But a son? How had they not known about this? He quickly pushed aside the nagging memories of how dirty her house had been, the needles they'd carefully had to avoid, the soiled underwear, the used condoms. He shuddered again. Surely she had not been bringing up a child in that hellhole. As he sipped the lukewarm chocolate drink, another worry presented itself. What if he and Denise were found to have been negligent in their duties? He didn't have to do much soul-searching to know that neither of them had been as diligent as they could have been. Though they were assigned a good hour with each client, the truth was they often rushed through their appointments, and if a resident wasn't home when they called by, they certainly didn't wait around for them to show up. Ben swallowed a lump in his throat as he remembered their last visit with Lorna, how quickly they'd hurried out of her squalid home. But could anyone blame them? He looked across at the small boy, who remained squatted in the corner. If she'd had a child this whole time, she'd done a damn good job of hiding him from them. He threw his cup in the bin. He was tired of trying to engage with this boy, and tired of worrying. He wanted to go home. Besides, he thought, as he watched the child return to sobbing, what was the point? In all his professional years, he'd rarely seen anyone break the cycle of drugs and poverty. Society largely turned a blind eye to the destitute, the grubby ones, and there was little in the way of support to help them get back on their feet. This poor boy had been given the roughest of rough starts, and with no obvious family and no strong role models, well, it would take a miracle for him to escape the almost certain fate of following in his mother's footsteps. "We're going to have to find him emergency accommodation," the police officer had returned. "You're free to go if you like." Ben smiled gratefully, leaping to his feet. "See you later." He waved sheepishly at the boy before hurriedly leaving the room.